close your eyes for a moment and strip away everything you know about comfort, safety, and choice. Imagine that the world you are about to enter has no patience for softness, no tolerance for hesitation, and no mercy for weakness. Imagine that before you even learn to speak, before you can understand fear, your life is judged by strangers whose only concern is the strength of the state. This is where a Spartan life begins, and this is why you would not survive even a single day. In Sparta, birth was not a celebration, it was an examination. The moment a child was born, he did not belong to his mother, his father, or even himself. He belonged to Sparta. His life was not measured by potential, innocence, or hope, but by utility. Elders of the community, men hardened by war and discipline, would inspect the infant carefully. They looked for physical deformities, signs of weakness, anything that suggested the child might one day falter under pressure. This was not done in anger or cruelty, but with cold efficiency. To the Spartan mind, mercy toward weakness was cruelty toward the state. If the child was deemed unfit, the decision was immediate and final. He was taken away, carried to a remote place, and left exposed to the elements. No ceremony followed, no grave marker, no record. His existence simply ended. In Sparta, death was not the worst outcome. Becoming a burden was. Pause here and think about that. Your first test in Sparta was not courage, strength, or intelligence. It was survival by approval. Your life depended entirely on how others judged your body in the first moments after birth. There was no second chance, no redemption arc, no chance to grow stronger later. If you failed this test, you were erased. And if you passed, if you survived this first judgment, your reward was not love or protection. It was obligation. From the very beginning, Spartan children were raised under the shadow of a single truth. You exist to serve something greater than yourself. Individual happiness was irrelevant. Personal dreams were dangerous distractions. The state did not want thinkers, artists, or philosophers. It wanted warriors, men who would stand unflinching in the face of death and obey without hesitation. Spartan mothers understood this. They were not gentle in the way modern parents imagine gentleness. They did not shield their children from hardship. Instead, they prepared them for it. From an early age, boys were taught to endure pain without complaint, hunger without begging, and fear without showing it. Crying was discouraged. Emotional expression was seen as weakness. To endure silently was considered the highest form of strength. Even language was shaped by this mindset. Spartan speech was deliberately brief and sharp. Words were not meant to comfort or explain, but to command and clarify. Long explanations were signs of uncertainty. In Sparta, certainty was everything. As a child, you would quickly learn that attention was dangerous. Standing out made you visible, and visibility invited judgment. You learned to blend in, to move as part of a group, to suppress anything that made you different. Individuality was slowly stripped away, replaced by uniformity and obedience. And all of this happened before the age of 7. 7, an age when most children are still discovering the world through play, curiosity, and imagination. In Sparta, 7 marked the end of childhood entirely. It was the moment when the state formally claimed you, but even before that moment arrived, you were already being shaped. Spartan children were deliberately exposed to discomfort. They were not overfed, they were not overprotected. Hunger was common not because Sparta lacked food, but because hunger taught discipline. Cold was not avoided because cold taught endurance. Pain was not softened because pain taught control. The Spartan belief was simple and ruthless. Hardship strengthens the worthy and destroys the unworthy. And destruction was acceptable. You would grow up surrounded by this belief, breathing it in as naturally as air. You would see older boys with scars and bruises treated with respect, while those who hesitated or complained were mocked. Shame was a powerful tool in Sparta. Fear of disgrace often outweighed fear of pain. Your role models were not kind men, they were survivors. Every story you heard glorified sacrifice. Every lesson reinforced the same message: your life is not your own. You are a part of a machine, and machines do not tolerate broken parts. Think about how deeply this mindset would carve into a child's mind. There was no space for vulnerability, no safe place to express doubt. Even affection was restrained, carefully controlled so it would not weaken resolve. Love existed, but it was conditional. Love for strength, for discipline, for obedience. Spartan mothers were famous for their severity, but it was not because they lacked feeling. It was because they believed that soft love created weak men, and weak men doomed the city. When a Spartan mother sent her son into training or war, she did not plead for his safety. She reminded him of his duty. This environment did not ask whether you wanted to be strong. It assumed that strength was your only acceptable state. And this is where modern minds begin to fracture when imagining Sparta. We are raised to believe that childhood is sacred, that growth requires nurturing, that mistakes are part of learning. Sparta rejected all of this. Mistakes were not lessons, they were warnings. Weakness was not corrected with patience. It was exposed, punished, and, if necessary, eliminated. From the earliest days, your sense of self would be reshaped. You would not ask, "Who am I?" You would ask, "How useful am I?" Your worth would be measured not by kindness, creativity, or empathy, but by endurance, obedience, and strength. Imagine trying to grow up in such a world. Every glance felt like evaluation. Every interaction carried risk. You learned to watch yourself constantly, to control your body, your voice, even your thoughts. Fear was not something you admitted to feeling. It was something you buried so deeply that eventually you forgot it existed. By the time you approached 7 years old, the transition into the Agoge would feel less like a shock and more like an inevitable conclusion. You had been prepared for it your entire life. Your home was never truly your home. Your parents were never fully yours. Everything had been temporary. And still, nothing could truly prepare you for what came next. Because up until this point, you had at least known familiarity. Faces you recognized, walls you had grown up within. At 7, all of that was taken away in a single moment. You were separated from your family and grouped with other boys your age, handed over to the state entirely. There was no ceremony, no goodbye filled with tears. Spartan culture did not encourage emotional farewells. Attachment was seen as a weakness that would have to be broken anyway, so it was broken early. As you walked away, you were not walking toward training. You were walking toward erasure, the erasure of comfort, the erasure of choice, the erasure of the child you once were. This is why the idea of a day in the life of a Spartan is misleading. There was no single day that defined the difficulty. The hardship was constant, layered, relentless. From birth onward, life itself was the test. And this is why you would not survive a day as a Spartan warrior. Not because you lacked strength, but because you were not forged from the moment you took your first breath. You were allowed to be human. You were allowed to feel. You were allowed to fail and try again. Sparta allowed none of that. In Sparta, survival demanded the death of softness long before the body ever faced a battlefield. The moment you turned 7, the last illusion of safety disappeared. There was no dramatic announcement, no gentle explanation meant to ease you into what was coming. In Sparta, transitions were not softened, they were enforced. One day you belonged, however faintly, to your family. The next, you belonged entirely to the state. You were taken from your home and placed among other boys your age, stripped of identity and familiarity. The faces around you were not friends yet. They were competitors, mirrors of your own fear and confusion, though none of you were allowed to show it. From this moment forward, comparison would be constant. Every weakness would be noticed, every hesitation remembered. This was the beginning of the Agoge. The Agoge was not a school in the way we understand education. There were no lessons meant to inspire curiosity, no encouragement to ask questions. Knowledge was not the goal. Control was. The Agoge existed to dismantle the child you were and replace him with something harder, quieter, and far more dangerous. Your first lesson was loss. You lost comfort immediately. The clothes you wore were taken away and replaced with a single rough cloak. One cloak. No matter the season, no matter the weather, summer heat or winter cold made no difference. Shoes were not provided. Your feet learned pain early, sharp stones, frozen ground, blistering heat. This was intentional. Pain was not an obstacle to be removed. It was a tool to be used. There were no beds. You slept on the ground, on mats made from reeds you gathered yourself. Cutting those reeds tore your hands, but even that was part of the lesson. You were expected to endure injury without complaint. Blood was not alarming, bruises were not noteworthy. If you were hurt, you carried on. Warmth became a memory. Hunger became a companion. Food was deliberately insufficient. You were fed just enough to keep you alive, never enough to feel satisfied. The constant ache in your stomach was not a failure of the system, it was the system. Hunger sharpened the senses. Hunger bred desperation. Hunger revealed character. You were expected to steal to survive. This is where modern minds often misunderstand Sparta. Theft was encouraged, but only as a test of intelligence and caution. If you stole successfully, you proved cleverness and discipline. If you were caught, the punishment was severe, not because you had stolen, but because you had failed to do it well. Beatings were public. Pain was instructional. They taught you that mistakes had consequences, and that those consequences would not be softened by explanation or sympathy. You learned to calculate risk, to move silently, to observe before acting. Hunger taught strategy. Fear taught restraint. And fear was everywhere. Not the loud screaming fear of sudden danger, but the quiet, constant awareness that you were always being watched. Instructors, older boys, even your peers observed you. Weakness did not need to be reported, it revealed itself. A slouched posture, a slow response, a flinch. Everything was noticed. Speech was restricted. You were taught to answer questions briefly, precisely, and without emotion. Long explanations were punished. Excuses were intolerable. To speak too much was to reveal insecurity. To speak too little, but correctly, was strength. Silence became your armor. Physical training filled your days. Running, wrestling, endurance exercises designed to exhaust you beyond comfort. You were pushed until your muscles burned and your lungs screamed, and then you were pushed further. Rest was minimal. Recovery was not discussed. You learned that fatigue was not an excuse, it was an expected condition. And when you collapsed, you were lifted and forced to continue. The Agoge was built on the belief that the body could be trained to obey the will, and the will could be trained to ignore the body. Pain was temporary. Discipline was permanent. This belief was driven into you relentlessly until resistance faded and obedience became instinct. But physical hardship was only part of it. The deeper transformation was psychological. From an early age, Spartan boys were encouraged to compete aggressively with one another. Rivalries were not discouraged, they were engineered. Conflict revealed character. Fights were allowed, even encouraged, so long as they did not involve weapons. These confrontations were not about fairness, they were about dominance. If you lost, you learned humility or shame. If you won, you learned confidence, but never mercy. Sympathy for a defeated opponent was not admired. It was suspect. Strength was respected, weakness was not. You learned quickly that showing emotion was dangerous. Crying brought ridicule. Fear invited punishment. Even laughter was controlled. Too much joy suggested softness. The safest emotional state was neutrality, focused, quiet, contained. Gradually you stopped reacting. You learned to keep your face still even when your body screamed. You learned to swallow hunger, suppress pain, and bury fear so deeply that it stopped demanding attention. This wasn't resilience as we imagine it. It was conditioning, and the conditioning worked. As days turned into months and months into years, something fundamental shifted inside you. You stopped thinking in terms of I want and began thinking in terms of I must. Desire was irrelevant. Orders were absolute. Survival depended on alignment with expectation. Authority was never questioned. Instructors ruled through fear and unpredictability. Punishments were not always connected directly to actions. Sometimes you were punished simply to remind you that control did not need justification. This created a state of constant vigilance. You learned not to relax, not to assume safety, not to expect fairness. Fairness was not a Spartan value. Strength was. Even your body changed. Hunger kept you lean. Constant movement hardened muscle and bone. Your posture shifted, your gait became purposeful, efficient. You moved less like a child and more like a tool. Every motion conserved energy. Every action had intent. And yet, despite the brutality, the Agoge was not chaotic. It was precise. Everything had a purpose. The scarcity, the pain, the humiliation, it all served a single goal: to erase the individual and replace him with a unit. You were no longer being trained to live. You were being trained to function. What makes this especially difficult to imagine is the absence of alternatives. There was no escape, no rebellion, no safe adult to appeal to. Everyone around you had survived the same process and believed in it absolutely. To question the system was to reveal that it had not fully worked on you yet. And that made you dangerous. To yourself. By this stage your understanding of the world had narrowed. There was Sparta, and there was everything else. Sparta was order, strength, and purpose. Everything else was chaos, weakness, and threat. This worldview was not taught through lectures. It was absorbed through experience. Cold nights taught you that comfort was a lie. Hunger taught you that dependence was weakness. Pain taught you that limits were negotiable. Slowly, almost without realizing it, you stopped missing home, not because you didn't care, but because caring had become useless. The Agoge did not allow space for longing. Longing distracted you from survival, so your mind adapted. It closed doors that could not be opened. This was one of the most effective and terrifying elements of Spartan training. It didn't just harden the body, it reshaped desire itself. By the time years had passed, you were no longer enduring the Agoge. You were embodying it. The rules were no longer external pressures, they lived inside you. You corrected yourself before punishment was needed. You silenced emotion before it surfaced. You moved in ways that avoided attention. You became what Sparta wanted you to be. And yet this was still only preparation. Everything you had endured so far, the hunger, the cold, the beatings, the humiliation, was merely the foundation. You were being emptied out, hollowed, stripped down to something raw and controllable. Because once the child was fully erased, Sparta would begin teaching you how to become something far worse than a survivor. It would teach you how to become a weapon. By the time the Agoge had taken its first real hold on you, fighting was no longer an occasional event. It was woven into daily life, encouraged not as an outlet for anger, but as a method of exposure. Sparta believed that pressure revealed truth, and nothing revealed truth faster than conflict. When boys fought, masks fell away, fear showed itself, hesitation surfaced, weakness became visible, and weakness, once seen, was never forgotten. You were not taught to fight with rules meant to protect you. There were no referees stepping in to stop a beating once it had gone too far. Injuries were expected. Blood on the ground was ordinary. If you were hurt, you were not excused. You were observed. How did you react? Did you panic? Did you withdraw? Did you continue despite pain? That reaction mattered more than victory. Spartan instructors watched these confrontations closely. They were not looking for fairness. They were looking for instinct. Who pressed forward when exhausted? Who adapted when overwhelmed? Who froze when things went wrong? Every boy was catalogued mentally, sorted by temperament and tolerance. If you fought and lost, the loss itself was not the greatest danger. The danger was what followed. Humiliation was a weapon Sparta used expertly. A boy who showed fear or broke down emotionally did not just suffer once. He became marked. Other boys noticed. Older youths noticed. Instructors noticed. That mark followed you. Ridicule was constant and merciless. Mockery was not discouraged. It was part of the system. Sparta understood that shame could carve behavior more deeply than pain. To be laughed at, to be dismissed, to be treated as lesser, this was often worse than a beating. It taught you to harden yourself internally, not just physically. So you learned quickly, never cry, never plead, never explain. You learned to keep your face still even when panic rose in your chest. You learned to swallow pain before it reached your eyes. You learned to control your breathing, your posture, your voice. Emotion became something you managed, like hunger or fatigue. It did not disappear, but it was locked away. Over time, even your thoughts changed. Sparta did not encourage introspection. Thinking too deeply about oneself was considered dangerous. It led to doubt, and doubt weakened resolve. Instead, you were trained to think outwardly and functionally. What is the order? What is the objective? What is required of me right now? Anything beyond that was excess. Speech training reflected this perfectly. You were discouraged from speaking unless necessary. When you did speak, your words were expected to be short, precise, and controlled. A long answer suggested uncertainty or an attempt to justify oneself. Both were signs of weakness. This way of speaking reshaped the way you thought. You learned to compress meaning, to remove emotion from language, to strip communication down to its barest form. This is where the Spartan reputation for sharp, cutting remarks was born. Words were not tools for connection. They were tools for efficiency. Silence, however, was even more powerful. Silence taught patience. Silence taught observation. Silence taught restraint. In a world where every word could be judged, silence was often the safest choice. And as silence grew familiar, it became comforting. Noise felt unnecessary. Emotional expression felt dangerous. Gradually, you stopped wanting to speak at all. Physical training intensified as you grew older. Running was relentless. You ran barefoot across rough terrain, learning to place your feet carefully, to endure pain without slowing. Wrestling became more brutal, pushing you to the edge of exhaustion again and again. Strength was important, but endurance mattered more. Anyone could fight briefly. Sparta needed men who could fight when their bodies begged them to stop. Fatigue was constant. You woke tired, you trained tired, you slept tired. There was no such thing as full recovery. This was deliberate. Sparta wanted to know who you were when you were depleted, because that is who you would be in battle. And when exhaustion exposed cracks, instructors exploited them. If you lagged behind, you were singled out. If your attention wandered, you were corrected harshly. Punishment was not always logical. Sometimes it was arbitrary, designed to reinforce the idea that authority did not need explanation. This unpredictability created a powerful psychological effect. You learned not to rely on fairness, only on adaptability. The world stopped feeling stable. But instead of breaking under that instability, you adapted. Humans always do. Your nervous system adjusted. What once felt unbearable became routine. Hunger dulled, pain lost urgency. Fear became quieter, easier to ignore. This is the part that is hardest to imagine from a modern perspective, not because the suffering was extreme, but because it became normal. What would horrify an outsider became background noise. What would traumatize most children became structure. You stopped thinking of your life as harsh. It was simply how things were. And within that harshness, a new identity formed. You began to define yourself not by who you were, but by what you could endure. Pride came not from success, but from resilience. You felt satisfaction not when things were easy, but when they were difficult and you did not break. This created a dangerous feedback loop. The more pain you endured, the more valuable you felt. The more valuable you felt, the more you believed the system was justified. and the more you believed in the system, the more willing you were to submit to it. Sparta did not need to convince you, it shaped you until you convinced yourself. By adolescence, your body bore the evidence of this transformation. Scars layered over scars, old injuries healed imperfectly. Your movements were efficient, economical. You wasted no energy on unnecessary gestures. Even rest was controlled, alert, ready, restrained. Your mind, too, bore scars. You learned not to expect kindness. You learned not to rely on comfort. You learned not to trust emotion. Vulnerability became foreign. Empathy narrowed, focused primarily on those who had endured what you had endured. Outsiders were difficult to understand. Their concerns seemed trivial. Their fears seemed exaggerated. This narrowing of perspective was not accidental. It bound Spartans together and separated them from the rest of the world. Shared suffering created unity. Shared hardship created loyalty. But loyalty came at a cost. As you grew, individuality faded further. Personal preferences were irrelevant. You ate what you were given. You wore what you were assigned. You followed the schedule imposed upon you. Even friendships were shaped by proximity and utility rather than choice. And yet, bonds did form. They were not soft bonds. They were forged under pressure. You trusted those who endured beside you. You relied on them because your survival depended on them. These bonds would later become the foundation of Spartan military formations, where men fought not just for the state, but for the warriors standing next to them. But even these bonds were secondary to obedience. No relationship came before duty. As the years passed, the Agoge pushed you closer to its most important goal, emotional suppression so complete that hesitation vanished. Sparta did not want men who debated orders internally. It wanted men whose bodies moved before doubt could arise. To achieve this, instructors applied constant psychological stress, insults, challenges, public correction, all designed to provoke reaction. When you reacted, you were punished. When you remained still, you were rewarded with silence. Silence became approval. Eventually, you learned to empty your mind under pressure, to exist only in the present moment, to respond without reflection. This was not mindfulness in the modern sense. It was conditioning for violence, because violence does not wait for careful thought. And this was the final transformation taking place beneath the surface. You were being prepared not just to fight, but to kill, without hesitation, without emotion, without inner resistance. Yet Sparta did not reveal this openly. Not yet. Instead, it allowed you to believe that everything so far was about discipline and endurance, that suffering had meaning, that obedience had purpose, that you were becoming something honorable, and in a way you were. But beneath the discipline, beneath the endurance, beneath the pride, something quieter was happening. A line was being erased, the line between self-preservation and obedience, the line between empathy and efficiency, the line between humanity and function. By the time the nights grew heavier and your training grew darker, you would already be prepared to move without being seen, prepared to act without being told why, prepared to silence parts of yourself you did not even know had a voice. And when that moment came, when Sparta finally tested whether you could become more than disciplined, more than obedient, you would step into the darkness not as a child, not even as a soldier, but as something far colder, something that no longer needed to be convinced to obey. By the time you reached adolescence, you were no longer just enduring training. You were being tested in ways that were quiet, secretive, and terrifying. The Agoge had already hardened your body, disciplined your mind, and reshaped your emotional responses. You could endure hunger, cold, exhaustion, and pain. You could fight, fall, rise again, and face humiliation without complaint. You had learned to suppress fear, to control anger, to silence doubt. You had become efficient, precise, controlled. But Sparta had not finished with you. Survival in the Agoge was only a beginning. The final lessons were darker, designed not only to teach obedience and endurance, but to strip away the last remnants of innocence, compassion, and hesitation. This phase was called the Krypteia. Few outsiders understand it. Few even within Sparta would speak openly about it. The Krypteia was a rite of passage, a test of loyalty, cunning, and deadly skill. It was the crucible in which the Spartan boy became something beyond human. At night, you were taken out of the barracks alone. You were armed with a single short knife, light enough to carry easily but capable of taking a life. Your instructions were not gentle, not encouraging. They were precise and terrifying. Survive. Hunt. Kill if necessary. And above all, remain unseen. You were alone. Daytime became your camouflage. You hid in forests, ruins, and abandoned buildings. You moved quietly, almost like a shadow, blending with the natural world while observing it, learning its patterns, its weaknesses. You had to see everything. Every movement of a branch, every sound of footsteps, every rustle of leaves could indicate danger or opportunity. The targets of the Krypteia were the Helots, the enslaved population of Sparta. They vastly outnumbered you, their sheer numbers making their existence a threat to Spartan control. The Krypteia was not about war in the conventional sense. It was about psychological domination. Killing a Helot was not just an act of violence. It was a lesson. It was proof that you could detach yourself from fear, from morality, from instinct. It was a demonstration that the Spartan state could transform a human being into a weapon. Hunting the Helots required skill you had not yet fully realized you possessed. You moved silently, crouching low in shadows, listening for any sound that betrayed your quarry. Your senses became unnaturally acute. You could hear distant footsteps, smell smoke from a hearth hours away, detect the flicker of movement in the corner of your eye. Every sense became a tool. Every instinct was sharpened to a razor's edge. And yet danger was constant. You were not invincible. If a Helot saw you, the power dynamic shifted immediately. Your life was at risk. You were young, armed only with a knife, facing someone larger, stronger, more numerous. You could not run. You could not cry. You could not show hesitation. Fear, if revealed, would be fatal. And this was intentional. Sparta did not teach mercy. It taught control. It taught detachment. It taught the unflinching resolution to act even when every natural impulse screamed otherwise. Compassion was dangerous. Hesitation was fatal. The Krypteia forced you to confront these truths not theoretically, not abstractly, but in every motion, in every breath, in every decision you made in darkness. The psychological effects were profound. Every night, you learned to override your instincts. Your body screamed at you to flee. Your conscience whispered that killing was wrong. Your mind tried to remind you that you were still human. But Sparta had trained you to ignore all of this, to obey first, to think later, to act without moral debate. And so you killed. You killed silently, efficiently, without hesitation. Each act was a lesson in itself. You learned that emotion could not interfere with survival. You learned that morality was a burden Sparta would not allow. You learned that the state's needs outweighed the needs of the individual. You learned that, in certain moments, to survive was to destroy. Yet the Krypteia was not solely about killing. It was about observation, patience, and strategy. Often no one was killed at all. Sometimes your task was simply to infiltrate, to move unseen, to test your own limits. You slept lightly, ears straining for every sound, heart racing at every shadow. Every movement of your body was controlled. Every breath was measured. Every instinct was disciplined. This phase of training created a new form of intelligence, a combination of cunning, patience, and ruthless efficiency. You could anticipate behavior, manipulate perception, and execute plans flawlessly. All of this was done alone. No companion, no guide, no mentor. You learned that survival was not communal at this stage. It was solitary, it was cold, it was absolute. And yet, paradoxically, the Krypteia also reinforced the bonds you had built with your peers. The boys who had endured the Agoge alongside you were the ones you would later fight beside on the battlefield. You learned that not everyone could survive alone. Those who did were remarkable, yes, but even among them, loyalty and cooperation were essential when the time came to act as a unit. During the Krypteia you also encountered fear, not abstract fear, not imagined fear, but pure, visceral fear. Every night you faced the possibility of death. Every movement could be your last. And the training of the Agoge meant that you could not panic, you could not run, you could not beg for mercy. You were forced to act under pressure, to channel every ounce of energy and focus into the singular goal of survival. This is a crucible unlike any other. Most human beings would collapse under such strain. Most children would cry themselves to sleep, call for their mothers, or run blindly into danger. But Sparta had eliminated that child within you. You were now conditioned to act, to endure, to survive, not for yourself, but for the state. The Krypteia also taught subtlety and patience in ways no other part of the Agoge had. You learned to observe without being observed. You learned to track without being noticed. You learned to wait hours in freezing water or dense brush, muscles cramping, stomach empty, body screaming for movement, until the moment was right. Timing became as crucial as strength. Silence became as important as courage. Every action, every decision, every small survival tactic was measured, evaluated, and internalized. Each night you returned to the barracks, changed in ways that no one could see, yet fundamentally altered. Every experience was a test not only of skill, but of psychology. Could you act without hesitation? Could you suppress fear? Could you do what needed to be done without remorse? Could you carry the burden of taking life without breaking? By the end of the Krypteia, something profound had occurred. Your body was no longer merely a physical instrument of survival. It was a weapon finely tuned to the will of Sparta. Your mind was no longer a collection of thoughts and emotions. It was a machine of calculation, strategy, and ruthless logic. Your conscience was still present, but it had been trained to defer to duty. Your instincts were still human, but they had been overridden by discipline. The final truth of the Krypteia, however, was the most terrifying. Survival in Sparta was not merely about endurance, skill, or obedience. It was about the capacity to suppress humanity when it conflicted with duty. You learned that the state demanded absolute loyalty, absolute control, absolute detachment. Compassion could kill you, hesitation could kill you, mercy could kill you. And when the Krypteia ended, you returned to the barracks not as a boy, not as a student, but as a creature tempered by darkness, trained to survive and to kill without regret. By now the transition from child to warrior was nearly complete. The Agoge had stripped away comfort, innocence, and choice. Hunger, cold, beatings, humiliation, and relentless training had reshaped every facet of your being. The Krypteia had added stealth, cunning, and the experience of absolute moral detachment. You were no longer a boy. You were no longer human, at least not in the way the outside world understood humanity. You were a Spartan warrior in formation, trained to operate efficiently, lethally, and without hesitation. And yet even now Sparta's training was not finished. You would soon learn that surviving alone was one thing, but surviving alongside others, in formation, under fire, in war, was something entirely different. The Krypteia had forged skill and detachment, but it had also tested your ability to exist within a system where obedience and efficiency outweighed instinct and empathy. You had been prepared for the worst, but the battlefield would demand even more. You would be forced to trust others implicitly, fight in unison, and risk yourself to protect your comrades. You would be required to act not for survival alone, but for the survival of a collective. The Spartan warrior's life was not just about enduring or killing. It was about merging into an organism larger than yourself, a living machine of war. And only then, after years of conditioning, isolation, and trial, could you be considered ready for what lay ahead. The Krypteia was the ultimate test of obedience, cunning, and lethal efficiency. It transformed boys into shadows, shadows into predators, and predators into soldiers who would one day stand unflinching in the chaos of battle. By the time you returned from your first night alone, your hands raw from gripping the knife, your body aching from crouching in frozen brush, your mind racing from the weight of action and inaction, you understood something fundamental. Survival in Sparta was not for the faint-hearted. It was not for the compassionate. It was not for the weak. And most importantly, it was certainly not for someone like you, someone who had known comfort, choice, and freedom. In Sparta, life demanded something extraordinary. It demanded the death of softness before the body ever faced a battlefield. It demanded that fear, mercy, hesitation, and even individuality be silenced. It demanded obedience without question, efficiency without hesitation, and loyalty without limit. The Krypteia was proof of that. It was the moment when a boy became something else entirely, a predator trained not for glory, not for honor, but for absolute, unflinching execution of the state's will. And as the sun rose after the longest night of your life, you returned to the barracks forever changed, carrying a truth that few outside Sparta could ever comprehend. The world would not forgive weakness, and you had already been taught to survive without it. By the time you emerged from the crucible of the Krypteia, you were no longer merely a boy shaped by discipline and pain. You were a young Spartan man, conditioned, trained, and tested beyond the limits of ordinary human endurance. Your body was honed, your mind sharpened, your instincts precise, and your emotions tightly controlled. Yet even at this stage, Sparta demanded more. Survival alone was no longer sufficient. Survival in isolation was trivial compared to survival in the structured, relentless machine of the Spartan state, where every man was part of a larger organism, every action accounted for, and every failure potentially catastrophic. Life as a Spartan adult began in the barracks, where men lived together, trained together, and learned that individuality was subordinate to collective existence. Your home was no longer your own. The family unit, once a space of comfort and attachment, had become secondary to the state. Now the barracks were your reality. You slept on narrow beds, often side by side with dozens of other soldiers, your body pressed against others in cramped spaces designed to reinforce endurance and adaptability. Privacy was a foreign concept. Solitude was dangerous. Every sound, every movement, every action was observed, recorded, and subtly judged. Even your sleep was subject to discipline. You learned to rest lightly, always alert, always ready to respond. Comfort was not permitted. Comfort was a weakness, a softening of the mind and body, an invitation for failure. Training did not stop. In fact, it intensified. Daily routines were rigorous, designed to maintain peak physical condition, sharpen reflexes, and perfect the techniques needed for combat. Running, wrestling, endurance drills, weapon handling, and formation practice consumed most of your waking hours. Fatigue was constant, never an excuse, never a release. Even small lapses in attention were corrected with immediate and often harsh instruction. You learned to operate under exhaustion, to make rapid decisions when your body screamed for rest, and to execute orders with precision when every instinct suggested hesitation. Every movement became mechanical, every decision calculated, every thought subordinated to duty. The barracks life was as much about mental conditioning as physical training. Living in close quarters with dozens of other men forced you to learn cooperation, discipline, and silent observation. You could not afford emotional indulgence, not when every man around you was both comrade and competitor. Every action you took affected the group, and every failure reflected on all. Group cohesion became paramount. You learned the importance of trust, but also the danger of misplaced loyalty. Spartan men were taught to rely on one another, to protect one another, yet always with an awareness of vulnerability. Complacency could be deadly. One weak link could doom the entire phalanx in battle. Therefore, constant vigilance became instinctual. Observation of your comrades was as important as observation of enemies. Despite the rigor and brutality, the Spartan system also taught strategy, leadership, and psychological endurance. You learned to read people, to anticipate moves, to calculate risks, and to act decisively. Exercises were designed not just to test strength, but to reveal character under stress. You learned to act under pressure, to maintain calm when chaos surrounded you, and to internalize discipline so completely that hesitation became impossible. Every drill, every sparring session, every night in the barracks served as preparation for the battlefield, where lives depended not on individual brilliance alone, but on coordinated, disciplined action. Marriage in Sparta was not a reprieve from this rigorous lifestyle. It was carefully structured to complement the system. Love, as we conceive it, was considered a luxury that could weaken a man. Spartan husbands were expected to marry young, but intimacy was rationed and controlled. Relationships were designed to produce strong offspring for the state, not to provide emotional comfort. Husbands and wives often lived apart. Men remained in the barracks, training and preparing for war, while their wives managed households. Visits were clandestine and brief, arranged around the state's schedule, a reminder that emotional attachment was subordinate to duty. Even in matters of family, the state's priorities dictated the rhythm of life. This separation, however, was not weakness, it was efficiency. It prevented distractions, reinforced discipline, and ensured that men remained focused on their responsibilities as warriors. Spartan culture emphasized that duty to the polis outweighed personal desire. Your life was no longer your own. Decisions were guided not by self-interest, but by the needs of the city-state. Individual feelings were secondary. Comfort, desire, and personal preference were considered dangerous indulgences that could undermine your performance and that of your comrades. Through these constraints you learned to internalize restraint, to suppress emotional impulses, and to focus entirely on purpose. Beyond marriage and domestic life, the demands of military readiness dominated existence. Spartans lived constantly with the awareness that war could arrive at any moment. Every day was preparation. Weapons were maintained meticulously, armor polished and checked, formations were practiced, until they became instinctual. Discipline was absolute. Obedience was non-negotiable. The Spartan soldier's identity was inseparable from his function within the phalanx. Survival and effectiveness depended on the ability to act collectively, to suppress individuality when required, and to execute maneuvers without hesitation. Personal heroism was discouraged. The victory of the group was paramount. Retreat was dishonorable, hesitation was fatal, and failure could mean death, not just for oneself but for the entire unit. In this environment, mental toughness was cultivated as rigorously as physical strength. You learned to suppress fear, anxiety, and doubt. You became accustomed to operating under extreme stress, often for prolonged periods. Hunger, fatigue, pain, and uncertainty were constants, not exceptions. These conditions were not arbitrary. They trained the mind to remain focused, to act decisively, and to prioritize collective survival over self-preservation. Emotional resilience became ingrained. You no longer considered the possibility of retreat. You no longer questioned orders. Hesitation was alien. Every action was deliberate, calculated, and aligned with Spartan doctrine. Spartan life also demanded moral detachment in ways that might seem shocking. You were expected to act without emotion in the face of danger, to kill without hesitation in battle, and to accept death as inevitable. Compassion for the weak, Sympathy for the injured or hesitation in the execution of orders was unacceptable. These traits could not survive in a society dedicated to producing soldiers capable of facing overwhelming odds and maintaining cohesion under fire. Moral flexibility was taught subtly but effectively. You learned that the needs of the state outweighed personal feelings, that obedience and efficiency were virtues, and that emotional indulgence was a liability. This conditioning ensured that every Spartan soldier could operate under extreme stress without internal conflict, a prerequisite for survival on the battlefield. In the barracks, training was also social and psychological. The hierarchy among men was reinforced continuously. Older, stronger, or more experienced soldiers guided and corrected younger men, often harshly. These interactions were not meant to humiliate arbitrarily. They were part of the continuous assessment of character, loyalty, and competence. You learned to endure insult and correction without reaction, internalizing the principle that personal pride was secondary to collective strength. At the same time, competition remained, a constant test of skill, agility, and mental sharpness. You learned to balance loyalty to comrades with personal ambition, to excel without disrupting the cohesion of the group. During this period, Spartan education emphasized strategic thinking as much as brute strength. You studied terrain, formations, tactics, and the psychology of both allies and enemies. Simulated battles tested your ability to act decisively under pressure, to coordinate with your unit, and to maintain discipline when the chaos of conflict arrived. These simulations were grueling, designed to expose weaknesses and to force adaptation. You learned that mistakes had consequences, not only for yourself, but for your brothers in arms. This cultivated a sense of responsibility, focus, and situational awareness that would be essential in real combat. Every exercise reinforced the principle that individual survival was inseparable from the survival of the collective. Even in daily chores and routine tasks, discipline was reinforced. Every action, from cleaning the barracks to tending to weapons, was expected to be performed efficiently and without complaint. Laziness was noticed and corrected. You were taught that attention to detail in minor tasks reflected your reliability in critical moments. The Spartan mind was trained to recognize patterns, anticipate challenges, and act decisively, whether in mundane routines or in the chaos of battle. There was no compartmentalization between personal responsibility and military duty. Both were fused into a continuous expression of service to the state. Despite the unrelenting rigor, you also experienced moments of camaraderie and unity that bound you to your fellow soldiers. Shared hardship created bonds deeper than friendship, forged in fire and blood. Trust became absolute. Every life depended on the competence and discipline of the others. These bonds were not sentimental. They were functional, practical, and vital. In moments of crisis, the instinct to protect and rely on your comrades became automatic. Loyalty was not optional. It was essential. The survival of yourself and those around you depended on it. Through all this, Spartan men maintained a constant awareness of mortality. Death was not a distant abstraction. It was ever present. You trained, you endured, and you acted with the knowledge that life could end at any moment. This acceptance was not despairing, it was empowering. It eliminated fear as a paralytic emotion and replaced it with clarity of purpose. Death became a measure not of failure but of courage, discipline, and honor. Every action, every decision, every risk was evaluated against the possibility of death, reinforcing a mindset of unflinching focus and control. Thus, by the time you reached the peak of your training in the barracks, you were no longer merely a man. You were a functioning part of a machine, a soldier who could endure extremes, act decisively under stress, suppress personal desire, and operate with absolute loyalty to the state. Your identity was inseparable from your function. You were conditioned to act collectively, to prioritize efficiency over emotion, and to maintain control over yourself under circumstances that would overwhelm most human beings. Even marriage, even personal relationships were subordinated to this system. You learned to navigate the balance between familial obligations and military duty, internalizing the principle that the needs of the polis outweighed all personal desires. Comfort, pleasure, and individual preference were distractions. They were luxuries Sparta could not afford and could not allow in those who would defend it. By now, the Spartan man had been forged. He had endured hunger, cold, physical punishment, and relentless training. He had survived the isolation and moral tests of the Krypteia. He had learned to act without hesitation, to suppress fear, and to operate efficiently under stress. He had internalized discipline, loyalty, and obedience. He had merged his identity with the needs of the state. Every instinct, every thought, every action had been shaped to serve Sparta's purpose. And yet, the greatest test was still ahead, the battlefield, where all the training, endurance, and psychological conditioning would be tested in the most extreme circumstances a human being could face. The Spartan man had learned to survive in the barracks, to act decisively, to suppress fear and compassion, and to function as part of an unbreakable collective. But in war, he would face chaos, death, and the ultimate measure of the system's effectiveness. The preparation had been relentless. The cost had been absolute, and only now, standing on the cusp of manhood, could the Spartan warrior truly understand the depth of what he had become, a creature of endurance, efficiency, loyalty, and lethal precision, ready to face the horrors of combat with unwavering discipline. This was the life of a Spartan man, unyielding, unbroken, and entirely devoted to the survival and supremacy of the state, where every personal desire was subordinated to duty, every fear was suppressed, and every action was guided by the unshakable principle that the needs of Sparta came before the self. By the time a Spartan reached full adulthood, every aspect of his being had been molded to serve a single unyielding purpose: to protect the city, obey the state, and endure the unimaginable without hesitation. There was no turning back. Every day had been a test of endurance, obedience, and resilience. Every night had been a rehearsal for fear and isolation. Every act of pain, humiliation, and deprivation had been a step toward a final transformation, one that demanded the suppression of individuality, the mastery of instinct, and the acceptance of absolute duty. By this stage, a Spartan was no longer merely a man. He was an instrument, a piece of a larger organism, a living weapon of the state. Yet the ultimate truth of Spartan life, the crucible that defined their existence, was found not in the barracks, not in the Agoge, not in the Krypteia, but on the battlefield. There every lesson, every scar, every suppressed emotion was tested to its fullest limit. Life itself became secondary. Survival was not a question of personal skill alone. It was a question of cohesion, of obedience, and of absolute self-sacrifice. The battlefield demanded unity, precision, and a level of discipline that most humans could not conceive. The Spartan Phalanx was the embodiment of this principle. Each man's shield pressed against his neighbor, forming a wall of steel and muscle. Each spear extended in unison, creating a deadly bristling front. Movement was calculated, synchronized, and precise. The strength of one depended entirely on the strength of all. To falter was to endanger not only oneself but the life of every man on either side. Hesitation was fatal, retreat was dishonorable, disobedience was unforgivable. In this environment, the training and conditioning of a Spartan became essential. Every scar, every bruise, every night spent alone in the cold and dark of the Krypteia had been preparation. Every moment of deprivation, humiliation, and relentless physical trial had been a rehearsal for the chaos of battle. You had learned to endure exhaustion until it became natural, to suppress fear until it was almost invisible, to act decisively before hesitation could arise. Your body responded before your mind could protest, and your mind operated with a clarity born of relentless conditioning. But even with all this preparation, the battlefield was unlike anything else. It was loud, chaotic, and unpredictable. The screams of men, the clash of weapons, the smell of blood and smoke, the sudden eruption of violence, these were extremes of sensory overload designed to break ordinary soldiers. Yet you were no ordinary soldier. You were Spartan. You had been conditioned to see chaos not as a threat, but as a structure in which to operate. You had learned to absorb sensory input, focus on the immediate task, and act with lethal precision. Fear was not absent, it was present, but subordinated to duty. Every instinct to flee, to cry out, or to hesitate had been trained out of you. The ethical and moral conditioning of Sparta also became fully apparent on the battlefield. Compassion, mercy, and hesitation were considered liabilities. You were taught to strike decisively, to act in the interest of the collective, and to suppress the natural aversion to violence. Killing became an act of efficiency, not emotion. Hesitation could mean your own death or the death of your comrades. Emotional indulgence was a luxury you could not afford. The Spartan warrior was trained to prioritize the needs of the city above all else, above family, above self-preservation, above life itself. Every movement was deliberate, every breath calculated, every step synchronized with the men beside you. The cohesion of the Phalanx created a strength far greater than the sum of its parts. Each man's survival depended on the other's discipline and skill. A break in formation could lead to collapse. A hesitation could expose the line to annihilation. This was why the training was so rigorous, so brutal, so continuous. Sparta did not produce soldiers who fought individually. It produced warriors who became inseparable from the machine they served. Even death was redefined. In Sparta, dying was not an end but a measure of honor. A warrior was judged not by survival alone, but by courage, discipline, and adherence to duty until the very last moment. Was shameful. Survival at the cost of abandoning one's unit was dishonorable. This ethos was taught from birth, reinforced in the Agoge, honed in the Krypteia, and tested in the Barracks. The ultimate command was simple and unambiguous: fight with your shield in hand or die. Spartan mothers reinforced this principle with a saying that would echo through every life, every battle, and every act of obedience: come back with your shield or on it. These words were not idle. They were a societal expectation, a command, and a moral imperative. The shield represented survival, courage, and the defense of the collective. Returning without it symbolized failure, shame, and dishonor. Dying in battle, holding the shield, was the ultimate expression of obedience and sacrifice. This ethos transformed fear into purpose, hesitation into resolve, and mortality into a framework for action. The battlefield demanded coordination and instinct beyond what most humans could endure. The Spartan warrior had learned in the Barracks and the Krypteia to act without hesitation, but the Phalanx tested these skills in real-time chaos. Spear against spear, shield against shield, men fought not for glory but for the survival of the unit. Personal emotion had no place. Pain, fear, and exhaustion were secondary to discipline, training, and duty. Every strike, every maneuver, every decision was made with the collective in mind. Psychological endurance was equally essential. The Spartan warrior faced horrors most humans could not imagine: the screams of dying comrades, the chaos of flailing weapons, the smell of blood and sweat mingling with fear, the unpredictability of enemy action. The mind could break under such stress. Yet the Spartan had been conditioned to endure, to focus, and to act decisively. Fear was acknowledged but subordinated. Pain was endured but not expressed. Doubt was irrelevant. The collective mission superseded all personal considerations. Even in the midst of violence there was clarity. Training had created reflexes so precise that action could be almost automatic. You moved, struck, blocked, and responded with a combination of instinct and calculation that was honed over years of conditioning. Each movement reinforced the cohesion of the Phalanx. Every man's survival depended on the reliability and discipline of the others. The battlefield became a place where training, endurance, and psychological conditioning converged into lethal efficiency. Yet the Spartan ethos also required emotional suppression beyond physical and tactical proficiency. A soldier could not grieve, hesitate, or second-guess. Compassion for enemies or hesitation at the moment of striking could lead to death, your own or another's. The warrior had been conditioned to view violence as necessary, pain as ordinary, and death as honorable if faced in service to the state. These principles ensured that every soldier operated as a predictable, reliable, and efficient component of the phalanx. Even in the rare moments of personal reflection, the Spartan warrior's mind was not free. Thoughts of home, family, or personal ambition were subordinated to duty. Love existed only as a regulated and secondary aspect of life. The city-state was the ultimate priority. Men fought, bled, and died not for personal gain, but for the survival and glory of Sparta. Individuality had been eroded to a point where survival, honor, and obedience to the collective replaced all personal desires. The ultimate test of Spartan conditioning was not mere survival, but unhesitating sacrifice. A soldier could be surrounded, wounded, or facing impossible odds, and still be expected to maintain formation, fight, and protect comrades. Fear and pain were irrelevant. Hesitation was fatal. Every warrior's life depended not only on his own skill but on his ability to act as a seamless part of the whole. In this environment, the distinction between self and collective disappeared. Identity was absorbed into function. Every breath, movement, and decision was measured against duty. Victory was not the goal, survival was secondary. The primary objective was the maintenance of order, discipline, and effectiveness of the phalanx. Individual bravery or personal glory was irrelevant unless it contributed to the cohesion and effectiveness of the unit. Heroism was not celebrated in isolation, it was recognized only as an extension of collective success. This is why Spartan soldiers were feared across the ancient world, not because they were individually stronger, but because they were trained to operate as a single, unbreakable organism in the chaos of battle. Even in death, the ethos persisted. To fall in battle was not failure, it was the ultimate fulfillment of duty. To die holding the shield was to demonstrate loyalty, courage, and obedience. To survive by abandoning the collective was shameful. Every Spartan understood this from birth. It was taught by mothers, reinforced in training, tested in isolation, and finally proven in the crucible of war. The city-state demanded nothing less, and those who lived to tell the tale carried the legacy of centuries of relentless conditioning and discipline. Through this rigorous and unyielding process, the Spartan warrior was made. From the moment of birth, through the Agoge, the Krypteia, the Barracks, and finally onto the battlefield, every element of life had been designed to erase weakness, suppress hesitation, and create men capable of enduring extremes. Comfort, emotion, and personal desire were systematically removed, replaced with discipline, obedience, and lethal efficiency. By adulthood, every Spartan soldier was an embodiment of the state, a living testament to the culture's relentless focus on survival, cohesion, and duty. And so, when the Spartan warrior marched onto the battlefield, shield in hand, spear ready, eyes focused, and mind disciplined, he did so as a culmination of decades of preparation. He was not merely a man. He was the product of an entire society devoted to war, survival, and the perfection of its fighting force. Fear existed only as a tool, doubt only as a challenge to overcome. Pain was acknowledged but endured. Death was expected, embraced even, if it fulfilled the state's purpose. The Spartan ethos demanded absolute commitment. You were not asked whether you wanted to survive, whether you feared death, or whether you loved life. These questions were irrelevant. What mattered was discipline, obedience, and cohesion. The city-state had claimed your identity, reshaped your instincts, and conditioned your mind and body to act with unflinching precision, under circumstances that would destroy most human beings. At the end of all training, all suffering, all preparation, the Spartan warrior understood the ultimate truth: life itself was secondary. Survival was not the goal. Duty, cohesion, and honor were everything. And in the final moment, whether alive or dead, the Spartan warrior fulfilled the promise whispered to him by mothers, reinforced in training and proven in battle: come back with your shield or on it. This was the culmination of a lifetime of discipline, sacrifice, and relentless conditioning. This was the Spartan ideal. This was why you would not survive a single day as a Spartan warrior. Not because you lacked courage, not because you lacked strength, but because you are human. Humanity, with its compassion, hesitation, and fear, is incompatible with what Sparta demanded. The Spartan warrior was something beyond humanity, a weapon, a machine, a perfected instrument of duty, obedience, and lethal precision.